So another question we got was, how do I know if a METAR includes wind shear? Well, first of all, let's define what wind shear is all about. So wind shear is a market change of wind speed and or wind direction by definition. And so the wind can change direction and speed vertically as well. So you see here on the lower left, this is horizontal wind shear, where we see the wind changing speed or direction on a specific horizontal plane. But the same thing can occur vertically with vertical wind shear, where you have it change in speed and direction with height. Both of these happen, and sometimes they happen at the same time. So a surface observing system like an AWOS or ASOS can't directly report wind shear. So if you look on your METAR, your for special observation, you're not going to see a METAR reported. It can, however, be reported in an ATIS broadcast. You'll see something like wind shear advisory is in effect. But as far as the actual report itself, you will not see wind shear being reported. However, they do have the capability at some airports, developed in the 1970s in response to several aviation accidents that were fatal in the commercial world, a low-level wind shear alert system. These are sensors that are spread in different parts of around the airport, usually again larger commercial airports, that can alert controllers when anytime there's a wind shear event occurring. And so the controllers can then relay that to the pilot or the crew to let them know this is happening. Again, if you go to all the major airports that typically will experience wind shear events, you're going to find this system installed. But we have no real-time access to this information. It all comes through controllers. So low-level wind shear alerting system doesn't get reported in an observation like you might see wind speeds or gust reported. So anytime you see strong and gusty winds in an observation, that's probably your biggest clue that there could be some low-level wind shear occurring. And obviously, anytime you're dealing with the possibility of convection, low-level wind shear is almost by definition a part of the essentially. So if you see a METAR reporting a thunderstorm, most likely you're dealing with low-level convective wind shear in association with that, and even the possibility of showery precipitation as another indication that you have a convection going on at that airport. So we generically call this convective wind shear. You may say, I've seen wind shear forecast in the terminal aerodrome forecasts. And you're right. It's called non-convective low-level wind shear. And that can sound very scary, but note that non-convective low-level wind shear, as you'll see it in the TAF, is not a forecast for turbulence. And certainly not a forecast for turbulence associated with convection, because it's called non-convective low-level wind shear. So let's take a look at this a little more carefully. So if you were to see something like WS020/16055 KT in a terminal forecast, this literally translates to the winds at 2,000 feet above field elevation, in this case 020, so that's 2,000 feet, are 160 true at 55 knots. So it's basically telling you the wind speed and direction at the top of that wind shear layer, in this case, 2,000 feet. What this forecast implies is that the wind rapidly increases with height within that 2,000-foot wind shear layer. And so essentially the 160 at 55 knots gives you the magnitude of the winds at the top of that wind shear layer. So we call this a form of vertical speed shear. Yes, the winds can change direction in that as well, but this is usually equated to wind speed changing with height, increasing with height over a short altitude span. And you may also find something called a low-level wind shear GAIR-MET. And that, again, it's a non-convective low-level wind shear forecast that's forecast over an area. And it's typically, for the GAIR-METs that you'll see, it's in the first 2,000 feet. So what this tells us, within that depth of that wind shear layer, how the wind speeds are changing with height. So in this case, where you have a 0 to 0, that's the depth of the, in this case, 2,000 feet of the wind shear layer. Then you have the winds at that particular altitude of 160 degrees, that's 55 knots. It shows you how the wind speeds are increasing. Of course, this is just an example. Winds could be fairly strong, still pretty strong at the surface, but essentially what you're seeing is the wind speeds rapidly increasing with height. And again, that's called non-convective low-level wind shear. So you might think, well, if that's the case, the winds are rapidly increasing with height, you might see in this particular case that maybe the air is rotating like a tumbleweed would over the ground. The problem with that is that this develops when the atmosphere near the surface in that wind shear layer is incredibly stable, usually courtesy of a temperature inversion. And so when you have that temperature inversion, which is a very stable atmosphere, it tends to inhibit any movement up or down. So anytime the air wants to move up and rotate, like that tumbleweed, the atmosphere tamps down that particular motion, or the other direction, whether it's up or down. And essentially what you end up with is very laminar or non-turbulent flow. And the air is basically said to decouple from the surface friction. And if it's decoupled from the surface friction, it's free to accelerate. And so what we get typically in these situations is what's called a low-level jet. Air doesn't really feel the ground and feel the friction because air doesn't move up or down. So that air just above the surface is free to accelerate unencumbered by the surface. And that's where you get the acceleration of the wind with height. So hopefully some of you remember the Mythbusters program. There was an episode called Bubble Trouble, which I think explains this pretty well. And that is Adam and Jamie built a 4 by 16-foot bubbler with a massive compressor, and they placed it at the bottom of a swimming pool. Then Adam gets in the pool and attempts to swim across that particular area where the bubbles were coming up from the bottom. And so you would think, if I'm in that pool and I'm trying to swim through all those bubbles that are coming up, it's going to make it more difficult to swim across the pool. And what they found is that if they put the compressor on 25% power, it proved pretty difficult for Adam to swim across that. But as soon as they cranked it up to 100% power, he could not swim across those bubbles, entire length of the pool. It slowed him down. And so when you think about this non-convective low-level wind shear, what we typically see in the atmosphere is that we see air rising. So the air is rising up like the bubbles in that compressor. And that prevailing wind has to interact with that thermal, that rising air. And as a result of that, it tends to slow down, inhibits that prevailing wind. But what happens if I take that thermal away? What happens if I make this situation very stable with no rising air or falling air? Well, it's just sort of like swimming across the pool without the compressor on. It produces very laminar flow. And therefore, that air is free to accelerate unencumbered by surface friction. And so that's essentially what non-convective low-level wind shear is all about. And so you can fly through that and may not even notice that it exists. In fact, we see this happen frequently in the overnight hours in many cases where the atmosphere is very laminar. The winds aloft can be screaming along at 40, 50 knots, 2,000 feet above the ground. And unless you notice the ground speed on your GPS, you probably won't even know it's there. It's so common that they don't tend to forecast it in the overnight hours. But when you see it forecast in a TAF and it's coupled with rain showers or thunderstorms even, yes, you can have convective and non-convective low-level wind shear in the same line in the TAF. That's when it can become problematic here. And the reason is that as that strong, especially when we start getting up into the 60s and 70 knot range, think about that wind that's flowing 2,000 feet above the ground. You have a heavy rain shower that pushes down through it, and it can turn that 75 knot wind straight down to the ground, producing a downburst or a microburst even, which would ruin your day if you're on short final. So when you couple this with a showery precipitation or even thunderstorms, that's when you want to pay close attention. You probably should avoid flying in those particular cases.